I'm really happy, as I was saying, to be here with the BBC News Labs team that has a lot to explain us about their experiments with automation and various AI technologies. Maybe we'll also get into what AI means for them. And they will tell us about creating new story formats from existing text articles using automation techniques. This is where I stop my screen, and I am very happy to get back with our fantastic speakers to welcome again David, Remi, and Conor. Really excited that you are here with us. So thanks so much for being here on this journey. And as I know, David will get us started. So David, on to you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to the festival. Yes, I would just quickly like to introduce myself. I'm the executive product manager for News Labs. Remi is an engineer in News Labs, and Conor is a journalist in News Labs. And I can hopefully just very quickly give a very brief overview of News Labs here. Essentially, we're at the intersection of four large groups within the BBC. BBC News, or editorial, is kind of the biggest. But also the engineering organization and the digital products organization, and to a slightly lesser extent, the R&D organization. And we're funded by all of these groups. We have reporting lines from the team up into these different groups. It's a real mix of skills. We have journalists, we have editors, engineers, product designers, and so on. What we do essentially is build working prototypes. So something a little more than just mock-ups. These are kind of prototypes that demonstrate the scalability as well as the functionality of new ideas. And we do those prototypes in a very fast-paced cycle that basically has us build a bunch of prototypes in an 8-week period, and then start from scratch and build another bunch of prototypes in the following 8-week period throughout the year. And then we also do some internal and external communications within the BBC. Is a big one. We are quite a conduit from information among these groups. So how I'll start this talk is by essentially just referencing the sort of this vast challenge that journalism as a whole, and public service news as well, is facing. And the articles there on the left there, just from the last week or two, I kind of collected a bunch of articles that demonstrate different characteristics of this this vast sprawling crisis that journalism is facing. And it shows up in the data from the Reuters Institute and from the Pew Research Institute and Ofcom and BBC's internal research. Lots and lots of good things going down into the right, and lots of bad things going up into the right. And we have this whole kind of vocabulary that describes this large sprawling challenge. You know, the business models, the declining trust, the platform power, echo chambers, the loss of young news consumers, subscription fatigue, and on and on and on and on. And so kind of a starting point here would be to ask, well, what might be at the root of all of these problems? And I think it's pretty obvious. It's this transition that the communication environment has gone through in the last 20 or 30 years, primarily with the internet, from an environment in which one entity, say a publisher or a broadcaster, had the power to talk to a lot of people, and that power was exclusive, kind of a one-to-many or few-to-many communication environment, to this new digital networked communication environment that is many-to-many, where everybody can communicate anything they want to everybody on the planet at a moment's notice. And that has these obviously these repercussions in that the power and the money and the attention and the relevance kind of transfers between these two shapes of the communication environment, from the publisher and the broadcaster, where it rested in the pre-digital era, to the platforms that facilitate this many-to-many communication. And so that's kind of the starting point for us in labs for a lot of our projects, is looking at things that we can do to sort of address this kind of core issue here. And the manifestation of that change, kind of for the audience and certainly for news organizations, is this almost infinite choice that essentially everybody has in the information that they can consume. And what that's really done is move us from this kind of one-size-fits-all news environment with a few television stations, a few newspapers, a few magazines, to this environment where there's basically kind of something for everybody. And so the audience, which was always very diverse, it's become very, very diverse also in its media consumption requirements in lots of different ways. And the challenge that we have at the BBC is that we have to solve that. We have to serve that audience with an app, with one app and one website. And so that's a real challenge because unlike other news organizations that can perhaps just target one large audience segment, we have this mandate for kind of universality or universal service. So we have this core challenge of how to serve that diverse audience from one app and one website. So personalization is essentially a requirement to address that challenge. And there are only so many things we can personalize. We can personalize the distribution of stories with recommender systems or so on. We can personalize how we present stories or format stories, and we can personalize the actual content of stories. And what we'll talk about here in this presentation is the personalization of the presentation or the formatting of stories. And that's more than just an aesthetic thing. That's something that lets different audience groups consume news using different consumption behaviors. So there's lots of different ways to consume news, lots of different focuses for consuming news, and this variation in presentation facilitates that. So how would you do that? So one way to do it is to make by hand multiple formats, just assemble lots of different formats by hand using journalists. And that's some news organizations are doing that. The Daily Mail is an example. The challenge for that is in the workforce. You need a very large and because of the economics, therefore relatively low cost editorial workforce to do that. Another approach might be to use algorithms, to use kind of machine learning and AI, and to sort of generate these formats completely automatically. And there are some examples of that. For example, the very successful Chinese app Toutiao is an example of that. But it's very technically difficult to do, and of course, you're giving up editorial control to the algorithm. The way that we've chosen to follow this is to use automation, but to use that in under full editorial control. So basically, to enable journalists to extend what they can do in terms of creating these formats, and to do that while still being able to edit and have the final say editorially. So if you look at this in terms of how the basic kind of workflow operates, the traditional workflow for journalism is very simple. It's basically a workforce in a editorial production workflow produces output, for example, articles, and then that output is published. Very, very simple. And so what we're doing here is we're adding this automation step where we're taking that output, in this case articles, and we're using that to automatically reformulate it into different outputs. And then we're taking those different outputs, we're going through another cycle of editing where the journalist gets to edit those outputs in a very, very fast and directed way, and then those different formats are published. And so we'll see a couple of examples and demos here. First of all, we'll hear from Remi, and Remi will talk about how we've been able to sort of use this technique to produce comics in our graphical storytelling project. And then Conor will talk about how we've used this technique to produce bullet summaries and image galleries in our Modus project. So I'll hand it over to Remi now to tell you about that.
Thanks, David. Like David said, here at the BBC, we have a remit to reach a diverse audience, particularly younger women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So our recent research into our audience's daily habits suggests that this group prefer to consume news by just reading the headlines or short articles. And they mostly get their news via social platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. They enjoy consuming visual content, and they're really keen to understand how news stories impact them and those around them. So here in News Labs, we thought, how about we actually give them what they want? To help our journalists do this, we created a prototype that generates graphical stories from a condensed version of the story that they publish online. Conor will show you how we can automate this using our Modus prototype later. Using that story text, we extract keywords or phrases, entities, and use them to find relevant graphics that tell the story. For each paragraph, we determine which panel layouts are possible. And we can offer up to 7 panel layout types at the moment, and you can see these on the screen here. If, for example, we detect a quotation from a person, we would offer this quote panel layout here. And we're also checking for ratios, percentages, and organizations, and offering panel layouts for these as well. If all else fails, we also have a standard text-only panel that we can offer the journalists as well. Our graphics were created by the design agency Complete Control, and they're designed to be standalone components that can be scaled, flipped, and combined to maximize the variation in stories. A man with a cap could indicate that it's a young man, whereas a man with a white beard, round specs, and a red woolly hat could suggest that he's Santa Claus. You get the picture. We also consulted with Neil Cohen, an expert on visual grammar, the art of communicating without words. Metaphors are a powerful tool in storytelling and are likely to leave an impression on your readers. I'm sure you winced after seeing this picture. Here's the panel editing interface where journalists can see all the possible panel variations and select the most appropriate one for their story. They can also amend quotations here as well. Before building the prototype, we tested mock graphical stories with 150 users, and 96% found the format engaging, while 86% said they would share it with friends. In fact, the numbers were so good, we didn't believe them and had to repeat the study. There was only a marginal drop in engagement when we tested with users on stories from the finished prototype. Let me show you how we create graphical stories with our prototype. So this is the graphical story editor. You can either write the text directly into the interface here, or you can paste it from a text editor of your choice. I'm going to just select the first few lines from a recent article on social care funding. Just drop it into the editor, and some panels will be generated. Now, this is just a first pass at the story here. If there's anything that you think that you would like to amend, all you have to do is hover over it and click the edit icon here. So you can see that it's detected a quotation from Rishi Sunak, but maybe we want to add that he's the Chancellor. So you can just update that and it'll update in real time. Maybe you want to edit the actual quote itself as well, and maybe say that it's 100 billion instead of 1 billion. Once you're happy, all you have to do is click close and it will update the story. Sorry, my internet's a little bit slow here, but you can see the updates have been added here. You can see that it's detected a percentage here as well, but perhaps the label that's associated with that isn't quite correct. So all you have to do is go in and you can change this to cancel text. So it's very simple there. Once you're happy with the story, all you have to do is click download story and you'll get a series of PNGs that you can upload to Facebook or Instagram. So now what's next? Well, our journalists have published a story to Facebook. They did that this October. And we want to just publish some more to see if we really are reaching those underserved audiences with this story format. And also see if there keeps them coming back to the BBC. We also want to explore how we can make the process of generating stories more sustainable and scalable. If we detect and extract graphics using object detection and image segmentation, we could automatically expand our graphics library over time. And a number of our journalists were also keen to put their own styling on the graphics, so we could achieve this using neural style transfer. Lastly, we know we can do this with still graphics, but could we automate an animation and create videos using the same approach? There's so much to explore in this space, and if you're interested in collaborating, we'd love to hear from you. Now, Conor will take you through our Modus prototype, another example of a semi-automated story creator.
Brilliant. Thanks, Remi. So as you can see, with the graphical storytelling project, we were able to basically prove the concept of using semi-automation to create these new modes of story. So after we got through that during the summer and saw what I hope you will agree are pretty brilliant results for a kind of first prototype, we started to look at, well, what other modes of story could we try to semi-automate and why? So if you think about the history of the BBC and the news that we produce it in multiple ways for our audience. So we started on radio, we still deliver radio, went to television and digital, and now, of course, we're all online and on mobile. So we're trying to match the audience's consumption habits wherever they are and give them the mode that they want of consuming a news story. So thinking about that and how we adapt to the audience, if you look at an online story today, as David started to kind of talk about it at the top of the presentation, the format hasn't really changed. So when the BBC News website went live in the 90s, and if you look at or compare a very old HTML page to what we produce today, the actual components of an online story haven't really changed. So you've got the headline at the top, you've got probably your big kind of splash image that's related to that news stories from on the day, and then you get a wall of text. So this is the top story on Brexit from Monday. And you can see basically after you've got the image, all you have is, so you've got subheads and nice breakdowns within the text, but you basically just get this wall of text of sentences, of paragraphs that are explaining the story, quite complex story in terms of a long-running story like Brexit and the trade negotiations. So we started to think about, well, what other modes could we try to automate and why? So in terms of what Remi was discussing, what way the audiences that maybe aren't coming to the BBC as much as we would like are consuming the news nowadays, we identified two modes to try and experiment with as the next stage. So they were bullet point summaries and image galleries. So in terms of bullet point summaries, we already see other outlets producing these, as David said, by hand. And even at the BBC, we've started to experiment with this. So on our live page for the biggest story of the last half of the year, with the US election, the long kind of drawn out results, we had live page journalists maintaining that page and actually updating a bullet point summary at the top of it to lead the audience into it and explain the kind of key points. But that was, of course, all done by journalists in the newsroom completely manually. The other reason we went, or the other mode we went for, and the reason we went for it was visual. So although Remi talked about the graphics, we also know that there's a lot of people that enjoy consuming the news visually now, and the still images that are related to a story, and also matching captions to try and break down a story and explain it in a more digestible way than a wall of text. So how do we go about semi-automating those two modes, or trying to make it more efficient for journalists in the newsroom who are already under a huge amount of pressure to produce them? So we went and looked at what's out there right now, and there's actually quite a lot available, open source machine learning models for summarization. So for the bullet point mode, we experimented with two basic forms of machine learning models that will produce summaries from a text input. So if you think about the wall of text that I showed, the story, the kind of the fully built narrative structure of a story, but it's still just text as the input. There's two available machine learning sort of models or categories that can produce summaries. So the first is abstractive, which is where the model or the program is actually creating new sentences. So it's taking the text input, analyzing it, identifying what is the fundamental core points and narrative of that story, and trying to write a short, abstractive, new summary of it. So producing its own language, its own sentence structure to give you a summary. The other option that's out there is extractive. So taking the raw input text again, but this time analyzing it, all the text for importance, and pulling out what it thinks are the key sentences. So we've tested a number of different models. Some people in the audience might be familiar with some of them. Other newsrooms are testing them as well, based on some of the events that we've done. We actually had a hack last week where a couple of other newsrooms were talking about how they've experimented with the same models. So they're stuff like BERT and Pegasus and Exum. So we tested them, and what we found was for the text summary, so a bullet point sort of summary at the top of an article, the abstractive modes were the most suitable. And for the image gallery captions, we've gone with an extractive model. So then the question becomes, well, is it really good enough? So if you've got the machine learning program writing new sentences, is it editorially valid? Is it good enough to use in a newsroom, to trial with journalists and potentially audiences? So the way we went about that was we sought out pilot journalists from the newsroom, as we often do in news labs, and we actually asked them to create their own summary of a story that they were writing for the website. So basically what their interpretation of a summary of their story would be. And that's what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. So a journalist who was writing a story on the lockdown measures in Liverpool, quickly after publishing the story, wrote their summary of it. And we then ran their story through the Pegasus model that we were using for the abstractive summary and gave them the comparison. So as you can see here, the like for like, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good, right? So it's giving them, it's identified the sort of key points. It's making coherent bullet points based on what it understands are the fundamental core points of that story, and producing and writing its own summary. So once you have the summary, you can then start to think about, well, what else can we use it for? So that's where we went to the inspiration of graphical storytelling again, to input the summary as the feed for what are the core entities. So what would be the search terms for building the image gallery? So once you've pulled out your summary, can you run entity extraction on that, identify the core entities for searching the image streams and pulling back relevant images to semi-automate the composition of your image gallery. The tool we're using for that is called Starfruit. So it's actually an open tool from BBC R&D. So the URL for that is there if you want to try it out. So basically you put in your summary text and it extracts the entities. So you can see it's pretty good there in terms of identifying Donald Trump and Joe Biden and the White House from the summary of a story on the US president having coronavirus. So once we extract those entities, what do we do with them? So in the case of graphical storytelling, you could see Remi demonstrating we were querying our own image library that we had commissioned. But in the case of still images, we're using a new tool that is currently going into production in the BBC called BBC Images. It's based on a tool from The Guardian that they open sourced called The Grid. And it basically provides us with the feeds of the newswire services we're subscribed to search all of those image streams with search terms and get back these search results, which then journalists choose to put into their story. So why are we doing that? Well, if we're asking journalists to create a whole image gallery, or say 5 core images to match the extracted captions that we think summarize the story, that's a big ask, right? So they're already under huge deadline pressure in the newsroom on a breaking story, and then finding even one relevant image at the moment is taking them quite a while. So this was during our research and testing in the last couple of weeks, some of the feedback we were getting from online journalists in terms of just the amount of time. If they've got 6 to 7 minutes to get a breaking news story up on the site, and it takes them 5 minutes to find one core image, or one suitable image rather, if we're asking them to produce many, we need some level of semi-automation to try and drive that and make that more efficient. So that's why we went into building a tool for this, and I'm now going to try and risk a live demo of it. So if you look at the top story right now, this might have changed actually since I've gone onto it. So we tend to update these top stories very regularly. But if you take the text of that summary, what you can do is put it in here to our tool. So this is the input to summarize. Click on summarize, and it is going off now to call those 2 models I was talking about. So it's doing the abstractive summary for our bullet points that potentially could be used on the article page at the top of the story, or also put in other forms into something like the news app or social media, so to give a kind of gist of a story. And it's also running against the extractive model that is trying to pull out what it thinks are the key sentences from this big block of text to build image captions, and going off to call that BBC Images tool, so the API of that, with its search query. So you can see it's run, and it's basically given me back here this abstracted summary, so 6 bullet points. Boris Johnson will fly to Brussels for talks with the European Commission President. So pretty good, right? In terms of giving a coherent summary, it's identified sort of the top point in the story, and then it's built out the rest of the bullets. And in the same way, it has gone to pull out 6, actually 7 sentences that it has identified as being sort of captions, suitable captions, top sentences for a image gallery mode. And basically, if you can see, for example, here it's repeated the same image. I was click on that image, and it opens up this editor panel, so they can edit the actual caption text, but then also vary the image, right? So you can select a different image that we've got back from our BBC Images API. You can also change the entities that it's searched for, so you can select combinations of these and alter the search results based on the other query that you could select. And if none of them are suitable, so for a big story like this with Brexit and Boris Johnson and so many kind of entities identified from it, you don't really have that problem. But maybe with a smaller story, for example, for business is one of the topics where a lot of the feedback from journalists was the difficulty in finding relevant images. You might not have as many entities. You can also do a manual search. So basically, it's a one-stop shop to hopefully create these 2 modes. Instead of you having to go off and search, you can just put in your search term here, and then export from this tool your image gallery, so you can save it as a text file or JSON. And we could potentially integrate it into a future version of the content management system, so that you could create these story modes there automatically. I think that's my cue to hand over to David to talk about where all of this could potentially lead to, or where we're headed next. I think you're on mute, David. I can hear you. Yeah, gotcha.
How's that? Okay, so where might this general approach go next? Like, how could we maybe extend this in the future? So one obvious place for, at least for the BBC, is into audio and video formats. And this is getting easier and easier every year. We're already doing audio formats from articles. The BBC has a project called Songbird, which does this. The Washington Post in their app kind of recently provided audio versions for each article, and this is done because the quality of synthetic voices is increasing all the time. We have our own synthetic voice that we've built for our Beeb audio agent that is quite impressive. So that's essentially an existing product. Most of you are probably familiar with tools like Wibbits and Watchit, which are automated tools for generating videos from articles. The quality of those videos, it's perhaps not at the publishable level, but taking this as a semi-automated workflow, they're definitely at the level of say rough cuts of videos. I've worked with these in the past in a different role, and the increase in productivity of the video team using these tools was pretty impressive. So that's becoming increasingly possible. And then if you sort of extend this concept of semi-automation from the raw article into data, natural language generation and automated journalism from that is becoming more and more common in more and more newsrooms. We use ARIA at the BBC for our automated journalism work, and we've done projects where we've taken the output of natural language generation or automated journalism and used that as a basis for synthetic voices. So we basically created audio products directly from data through natural language generation. And that concept can be extended even further into video. There's a company called Synthesia that earlier this year released its a text-controlled avatars. So these are basically trained models of how people behave and how their facial expressions move and their lips move when speaking certain sounds. And so essentially you can input data or you can input text and have that text kind of rendered as a talking head video. This is Synthesia. If you want to have some fun, go and check out their virtual Santa or their fake their deep fake Santa. It's a lot of fun. Wibbits have a tool called Wavy, which uses data as an input instead of the article as an input. So this is all becoming possible. We started playing around with these kind of tools in the summer this year. So although it's less developed, I think audio and video formats using this approximate technique are very, very close. Another thing that's close is language or cross-language news products. So if you look at language as a format, moving say a piece of content to a different language, that's increasingly possible too. And this is basically driven by the quality of these models. Google Translate is the sort of the main example here, and they've passed a threshold where people can use them routinely to consume content. I'm sure all of you do this quite regularly. I know I do, and lots of other people do as well. So more and more content is being consumed across language using these tools. We recently used Google Translate, and there's an in-house tool for less resourced languages that we've been working on. It's a large research project that we're a media partner on called Gourmet. We built a tool to automatically translate live pages, and these live pages, this is not for direct publishing. There's still that semi-automated editorial step in between. But in the research for this and in the interaction with editorial for this, we're noticing that more and more journalists are using mostly Google Translate informally. And then at the EBU level, there's a large project in their innovation team called Eurovox, and an expression of that called NewsPilot that basically involves the auto translation of articles and also videos, which is something that we played around with in labs in a project a few years ago. And this is essentially driven by chaining models together. So there's an automated transcription model, automated translation of the transcription, and then automatic synthetic speech rendering back into audio. And so that's still very early, still not really at the level you can publish directly from it. But the fact that it exists at all is quite interesting. And then there's this whole field or area of conversational experiences like voice chat or chatbots. And so this has been, we put a lot of work into this. It's had this set of challenges that have to do with the structuring of the dialogue trees and so on. But there's entirely new approaches that are being opened up by new language models like GPT-3, for example. They're not suitable yet because they're not really controllable editorially. Although you could, if you did have an editorial step downstream from them, they may already be usable. But if at some point in the future these kinds of models become more controllable, then there certainly is potential there for automatically or semi-automatically generating vast dialogue trees that would basically drive conversational experiences around news that we've never seen before. So these are all kind of some of the things that are maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years away from being real products. So just to look at this to sum up here, we have this traditional process for journalism that's been around since about the 1640s, which is a journalist writes a news article and then publishes the news article. And what we've talked about here is adding some automation to that, where the journalist writes the article, and then we've used that article to drive, with some automation, to drive a generation of comics, of image galleries, and of bullet points. And looking at some of that future-facing stuff, extending that into audio, which has kind of already happened, and extending into video with tools like Wibbits, that's not that far away for us. But one of the questions you could kind of ask yourself here is why are we basing all of this around an artifact that originated in the 1640s? Why are we using that artifact to drive all of these new formats? And maybe there's a different way to do it. Perhaps there's another artifact, some kind of what we sometimes call internally story model, some kind of structured story model that could act as the central artifact for a story, and then that model in turn would be used to generate all of these different formats. And one of those formats would include text articles. And at some level, we're already doing this with natural language generation and automated journalism. But the sort of the exciting thing about doing that is that there's no end to the number of new formats that you could drive. You could theoretically sort of extend this list to whatever happened to come along at any time, if the representation of that story model allowed for it. And another way to think of this is along the lines of abstraction. So it's moving from the level of the specific or the case by case article to the level of designing stories for this sort of pattern of expressions that's essentially a layer of abstraction higher than traditional journalism. Or another way to look at it is as a move from the more artisanal or handcrafted form of journalism that's been around for centuries to a more industrial or even post-industrial form of journalism. And that might seem like it's a little far-fetched, but there's already tools that support this that are being kind of widely kind of used and adopted, although not yet for new formats. And these are these post-article content management systems. The biggest one that I think people are familiar with is the ARC publishing system from the Washington Post. I think it's in use in about 130 newsrooms around the world. And that's essentially a modular content management system that is based on units that can support that story model rather than just a big block of text. And at the BBC, we have our own version of ARC. We call it Optimo. It's the next generation CPS that's currently being rolled out into production. And that is a post-article content management system. It's based on blocks. It has the idea of variations on blocks. And so that's the kind of content management system that can enable this, this more abstract kind of form of journalism. So we're just kind of starting down a road with this. And I think I'll just leave it there, and maybe we can take any questions.
Thank you so much to all of you for the presentation. This was excellent to follow, and I think just by starting using the comments that we have on YouTube, you might recognize the name of your former colleague, but I think this summarizes pretty well our feeling. Dimitri's just saying, wow. There is really like a lot going on in your experiment, so this is really fantastic. So thanks for sharing all of this with us. Obviously, some of the topics you mentioned will be reconsidered during the festival week. We have a session on Friday where one of our collab teams will tell us about their own experiments with summarizations and bullet points and so on. So really glad to see this thread of experiments that have been running through in different newsrooms. So that's so good. So again, thank you, David, Remi, and Conor for your presentation. We have loads of questions already, so I'm going to try to do my best at filtering them all. And I will start again with Dimitri was one of the first ones to drop a question on YouTube. And he was asking about the scalability from language to language of this kind of experiment. So also considering, of course, Dimitri used to work at the BBC World Service. I wonder if you have already done any experiments or if you have any insights to share about how all of this is potentially scalable to other languages.
I can just chip in on that. So yes, we've actually already done quite extensive user testing in Indonesia with the graphical storytelling. And that was quite successful. And we think for the World Service that there's two major markets for graphical storytelling specifically. One is in low literacy markets, and the other one is in multilingual markets where people have high literacy in some languages and then less literacy in other languages. But we tested that in Indonesia with quite some success. That one's actually pretty easy because once you get it down to kind of the bullet point or the caption level, or the text, then the automated translation works very, very well at that kind of a level. So the combination of automated translation of these tools makes it accessible pretty much everywhere we've got language models for.
Excellent. Thank you, David. I'm going to do my best, as always, to balance out the questions from YouTube and Telegram. So I'll go to Telegram first, where Lynn was asking two questions, actually, but both in a way related to audience engagement. So Lynn was asking if the bullet point summarization, for example, has given you any insights about potentially increasing dwell time and attract new audiences. And a similar question about the Insta stories, like, did that help you retain or find new audiences thanks to those experiments?
So we're not quite at that stage yet. We've just very recently begun publishing with the graphical storytelling, and we've kind of that's on pause for a little while for various reasons. So it'll be probably 3 to 6 months before we know that. We haven't published from the Modus prototype yet. And again, that'll probably be sometime maybe in Q1 before we do that. So I think it's probably going to be about 3 to 6 months before we have analytics on our publishing on these.
Got it. So as I said already in a couple of more festival sessions, this means we will have to invite you back 1 year from now and hear about the developments in that field as well. I'll get to a question that, Remi, I know you have seen it already in the backend from Iman on YouTube, and she was asking about the graphical storytelling, if you can extract information for social media posts like Twitter from these panels. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so as long as we can get some form of entities from the posts, we can then match them to graphics. It might be a little bit difficult because social media posts tend to be quite shortened and condensed, but there is always the text-only panel as well. One thing we were looking at, some journalists were quite keen on, was being able to upload their own graphics as well, so that even if we don't match to some in our library, they can upload their own. So that's something you can play
Great,
around with
thank
as
you.
well.
I think just to play in-house, I know our own director, Charlie, had a question that I'm going to try to find in the stream and put it up here. Yes, Charlie was asking if all of this works only for existing BBC content, or if that allows you also to go directly to other sources and then use that kind of content to run these kind of experiments. I don't know who among you wants to answer this.
I mean, technically, that's definitely possible, right? So it's just taking text input. We have designed it, or the concept has been built, as David was talking about, with the kind of text story as the input. So that was the philosophy or the design principle from the get-go. So that has been a requirement. I mean, we haven't really experimented. It kind of goes back to that previous question, like a Twitter post or, you know, an update from a wire or something. I mean, it's all text language, right, to put in. So we could definitely try it. And I think Charlie's getting at the editorial oversight there as well. So yeah, it's important to highlight at the moment, any of this stuff that is published is going through a human editor. And it will be for the foreseeable
I think
future.
that's also a message that your huge editorial teams around BBC will appreciate and will be happy to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about efficiency for them, right? If we are to produce all these different modes, can we help them?
I like to call it superpowers for journalists. You know, it's worth remembering that Clark Kent was a journalist, and every journalist should have some superpowers so that a single journalist can produce dozens and dozens of formats. So that's what we like to think we're doing.
That's great. I think we should reuse this tagline throughout, because it's a really good way to explain what we're trying to showcase with this festival as well, in terms of these superpowers as well. I guess I'm going to pick up on something you were mentioning already before. You a little bit talked already about, again, the journalists using these tools around BBC, maybe giving you some feedback about things that they would want to try out. On the opposite side, I was wondering if you could speak a little about potential challenges that you encounter in kind of explaining to editorial teams why they should learn to use another new technology. We know there have been many waves of innovation that editorial teams have been going through in recent years.
Do you want me to try and talk on it, Dave? I mean, I think the way we approach it is, like, a lot of people are very enthusiastic when they see these demos about how they could help them and drive efficiency for their day-to-day work with the demands on their time. I mean, the image selection is a very good example where all we're trying to do is give them, instead of them having to manually search for all those terms, at least give them the first pass at that and let them kind of preview it. With some of our other, like, semi-automated work, David touched on ARIA and the natural language generation. I mean, that was allowing us to create stories at a scale that you just can't do if each one has to be written by hand, you know, by a human. So it's very much that we're kind of like supplementing or creating brand new things as opposed to trying to take away roles like the duties. You know, we're more just creating things that weren't previously possible.
That just from my point of view, I've been at the BBC 2 years now, and I've been very surprised at how open the editorial organization is to forms of automation. I don't see any barriers in terms of sort of cultural barriers to automation. I'm sure they're there somewhere, but I haven't come across them yet. I think the one thing that we have to focus on intensely is respecting their time. Because journalists essentially have no time, and so if you can show the delivery of value without asking them to do a bunch of time-consuming work, they're very open to that. But they basically have very little time, but lots of interest in getting their stories out there in different ways.
I think, David, you touched on that key point that showing them value is really important. So if you have early audience feedback, that can be a key incentive to getting involved as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think those are great insights for anyone who's listening on the other side of the screen about really how to make this relationship kind of work efficiently as well between those running experiments like your team does and the various editorial teams of a news organization. So thank you for that, for answering that in depth. I wanted to touch upon another topic that David, you were mentioning towards the end. That's also a conversation that you and I had a few weeks ago about the potential for synthetic media. You mentioned a little bit about that experiments. You mentioned Synthesia also as an interesting company in that space. Usually when people think about synthetic media, often the conversation veers quickly towards deepfake and so the dangers of it. But I was wondering if you all could speak a little bit more about what you could see as actually potential use cases for BBC in that space.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I've done a little work in that. So I think there's two things to keep separate in your mind here. So one is the automated video, essentially editing or production that things like Webbits and Watchit have been doing. And there was a small conference just last week in which some academics produced some very extensive studies about audience reaction to these tools. And although those sort of automatically produced videos, although they weren't obviously at the same level of customer value as the manually produced videos, they were getting pretty close. So I think that is a reasonably kind of well understood path to automation for video. For synthetic video, which is a different thing, I think this Synthesia step just this year is a big one. They're focused mostly on things like training and kind of personalized reports and so on. But I think we've just begun to kind of explore the possibilities for using that for text or for news. I think one of the use cases that may show up early, and this is where we've been doing our experimentation so far, is in connecting it to the natural language generation. So this is for data-driven stories where you use the data to create text from the natural language generation, then you use the text to create the synthetic voice, and then the phonemes from the synthetic voice to create the visemes in the synthetic video. And then I think at some later point, I haven't seen anybody experiment with this, but I think the combination of the two becomes super interesting. So this is where you take a Webbit style kind of production or video assembly process, and you combine that with a talking head or a presenter, and especially if you can customize that based on data, then you have the potential to have exceptionally customized and localized and personalized presentations of news that are assembled completely automatically or mostly automatically. But I think this is going to be an active field of experimentation in the next, probably as soon as the next 2-3 years.
Thank you, David. There's well, we're out of time, but we have still 3-4 minutes, so I will try to take the last few questions that I see on the two platforms. There's a little bit of a technical question, but I think a very interesting one from Sabina here on YouTube. And she was asking, how do you classify images on your databases to make them easily findable and to results consistent with the text? I think she's referring to the graphical storytelling experiments.
Do you want to take that, Remi, or?
Sure, yeah, I can start, and Conor, you can pick up anything that I miss off. But we actually have a really simple, just this JSON structure. We're just storing that. We've moved it to a database actually now. But basically, you have the entity and the images that relate to that entity, and then we've also got synonyms as well. So it will match on all of those. We're also using fuzzy matching, so it will account for any like spelling errors or plural cases as well. Yeah, it's a very simple structure that we're using.
Thank you, Remi. Conor?
Yeah, and on the so the images, the still images, they're coming directly from wire services. For example, we're just using the metadata provided by them. So there are some keywords like file, photo, as opposed to something that's coming in from a live event. However, overall, I think some of the feedback from the team that have been working on that BBC images is the inconsistency of that metadata across providers. So that tool is bringing in all the different wire services that we subscribe to, and there's no global standard in terms of that metadata. So that's one of the challenges that you have trying to retrieve them in this way also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Conor. One last question that I see on Telegram, I think is more about maybe general, about the scope of the News Labs in general. Most of what we've been talking, of course, during this presentation is referred to your experiments, obviously, to help the journalists at BBC with new tools. There's a question on Telegram on whether News Labs is doing anything on the user experience side, or if you're not, if you have seen interesting things, well, AI could help improve the user experience for newsreaders and viewers.
Well, I would argue that these tools, graphical storytelling, for example, are both. I mean, these are helping journalists, but it's not the journalists that are reading the comics; it's the end user. So yeah, I mean, most of what we do in News Labs is audience related in some way. Sometimes it's direct experiences. Sometimes it's combinations of new ways for journalists to do things that lead to audience experiences. Sometimes it's back-end only tools, but audience-facing tools are a big part of what we do. So I wouldn't make that separation maybe as distinctly as that. There's usually a bit of back-end in the front-end stuff and a bit of front-end in the back-end stuff.
Good, excellent. Remi, I saw you were nodding as I was asking the questions. Anything you wanted to add on this?
No, I was just agreeing with David. Yeah, usually our projects overlap both because you need the journalist to produce the output. So yeah.
And there may be a learning in there. I mean, I think you can't really do, like in a newsroom environment, you can't really do an audience-facing tool without sort of deep interaction and involvement with the newsroom. And I think that's that's maybe one of the things that helps us kind of move through all these prototypes so quickly is that we just by default include and involve the newsroom in most of what we do. It's a central part to any success that we have.
Now, thank you for this answer, because it's really interesting and it resonates also, I think, with our own experience at Journalism AI. When we published our research report last year, we kind of separated the applications that we learned were out there in the buckets of news gathering, news production, and news distribution. But over the past 12 months, it has become more and more difficult to actually neatly put one case study when we find it in one of those categories, exactly because of what you just explained.
Yep.
That's amazing. So I think we can wrap it up here. We are already a little bit over the 60 minutes, but it doesn't matter. That was absolutely worth it. So I want to thank you again, the three of you, David, Remi, and Conor, for the presentation and for your openness to ask the many questions that we got from the audience. And I'm really sorry if we didn't get to answer maybe all the questions. We'll try to pick them up and answer separately. And we will also share again your presentations with the public so that they can also dive deeper and review the interesting experiments that you share with us. So that was greatly appreciated. I really want to thank you again for joining us here. And I will go off with this. We will be back online at 4 p.m. GMT for the last presentation of the day with Chris and Flor from one of our collab teams. And with this one, thank you everybody for joining us. We are officially over the halfway point of this Journalism AI festival, and I look forward to keep having this conversation with you over the next 3 days. Thank you, everyone.